There are many obstacles that can block the path to a successful software project. When you come across one, it helps to think like a seasoned hiker and follow the trail marked by blue blazes around the problem so that you can get back on course and keep moving forward. Welcome to Blue Blazes Podcast. I'm your host for the journey, Jay Tower, and I'm a partner and principal consultant at Trailhead Technology Partners. In this series, we talk with industry experts who share their best tips for avoiding the pitfalls on the path to successful software projects. My guest on this episode of Blue Blazes is Jimmy Bogard. Jimmy is best known for his contributions to open source software, particularly as the creator of AutoMapper and Mediator. Jimmy is an independent consultant and a partner at Soliance, where he helps enterprises build robust, scalable software solutions. He's a 15-time recipient of the Microsoft MVP Award, and you can find him at many events around the world sharing his expertise. In this episode, Jimmy and I discuss vertical slice architecture and how using it in your projects can make them more predictably successful. We delve into how VSA organizes your code by feature, allowing you to more easily and reliably make the most common type of change to your application without risk. I hope you enjoy listening to our conversation. Hey, Jimmy, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure for sure. So we're talking about something that I know is near and dear to your heart, which is vertical slice architecture.
It's near. We'll see how dear it is. I don't know.
Well, I know you've been talking about it a lot for the last few years, and I know a lot of other people are talking about it. So I think it's going to be a valuable topic for the listeners. But with the theme of the podcast, which is about making projects more predictably successful, how do you think vertical slice architecture does that? And maybe just to start out with, what is vertical slice architecture for the uninitiated?
Oh gosh, yes. So the idea of I had a one sentence thing for a while there, but it's the idea that we build and architect our systems around the axes of change in our system. And typically an axis of change goes through, well, the vertical slice of front to back end of our application. And so it's optimizing really around cohesion of things that change together, belong together, instead of organizing around, like or different types of things. It's really building and optimizing your systems around things that change together, to not just put them together, but really to build them in a cohesive structure so that they really are really tightly bound to each other as well. And when we were drawing this, it was like, most people draw like layers of like, presentation layer and the service layer and data access layer. And it came around a project where we did a bunch of that and realized that when we're building our systems, we don't work in layers, we work in vertical, and eventually it's like, oh, that's a slice, because it's a slice of a cake or something. I don't know. So it's really the idea of building and architecting systems around those slices versus building and organizing and architecting around layers.
Yeah. So the aha moment for me when I first heard you talking about this was when I pictured adding a field to maybe a model class or to a table in the database, and then kind of going up all those layers to make those changes, and the 15 code files that I would have to open to do that in a layered architecture, and to make essentially one change, right? One conceptual change, and then to see how that works differently in vertical slice.
And that's the way it started for me too, was I was tech lead on the project that birthed AutoMapper, so whatever that means. As a tech lead, I saw like it's supposed to be a long running project, like 18, 24 months. I mean, we released them before then, but it was a very long running project with a team of 8 to 12 developers. And so we were just churning out features, and it was really my job to see how can I enable the team to move faster. And one of the things I did was exactly this, is like I'm drew in the whiteboard behind the team. We still had like colo offices and all that junk. I just drew in the whiteboard, like, okay, here are all the files you have to change, and here's what you need to do exactly that. Add a new screen to the system or add a new field to a screen to the system. What all the places you need to go to be able to make that change. And then after that project, I look back and like, this is really weird how we're having to like jump around everywhere in the solution for a single story, right? It's like a single user story we're delivering, and the places we needed to change were just all over the place in the solution. Like they weren't disorganized by themselves, right? But I looked at everything that needed to be delivered for a single feature or user story, and they were just spread everywhere. So it really just started out with just like, well, why are we doing that? Why are we if these things all need to change at the same time or get added at the same time,
Yeah.
why scattershot them all over all over the disk, all over the Solution Explorer, and said keep them all together. So it started as that, but then sort of grew from there, realizing that once we did that, we eliminated a lot of the problems we were running into with a more layered architecture. In particular, we were noticing that because we were building some of these objects and classes were sort of layer wide. And what I mean by that, it's like you have a service, repository, helper, manager, blah, blah, blah. These things that have 5, 10, 20 methods, each of which are originally designed for one specific use case. But because they're in this class that is sort of visible to everything, that is every feature, every use case, then it's very easy for people to just like, oh, I need something that sounds pretty similar to that thing over there. Let me just go ahead and call it because it's in this location that doesn't indicate that it's special for one specific use case.
Yeah.
And what that led to was just coupling. That we eventually got to the point where we have all these specialized methods that were intended to be used for one use case, but because they look kind of like we needed at the time, we went ahead and shared them, which meant if we needed to change them, we could be affecting a lot of other different use cases and features. So the other part of the vertical slice was like, don't do that. Initially, like keep everything together specific to a use case or slice in one location, and not through like project structure or whatever. It's really just making the intended architecture, the intent explicit in our design and structure, and not make it a don't forget you can't call this, or like make it a very upfront and explicit that these things are really designed for this specific use case. And if you need something for something else, then you can pull it out in some place that's shared, but don't make that the default or
Right.
like the initial design is everything can use everything in this class because hey, it's there it is. Just
Right.
go ahead and call it whatever.
I suppose if the way our teams worked realistically was that there was like a data access team that was working truly on a data access layer of the application, and that's all they ever touched, maybe that would make sense to have
Yeah, and
those.
we did have this of like, I mean, there's always going to be people that are better front end versus back end,
Sure.
and there's going to be some specializations. But even in those cases, we still try to keep everything together, so we knew like everything required to deliver this feature or this
Yeah.
use case or whatever was like it's all right here. You don't have to go hunting around, and even worse, like okay, if I go hunting around and I see it's in some shared location, then like okay, let me go now do the extra work, which is to investigate if I change this, am I going to break anybody? So for our teams, it was sort of liberating that I don't know. I haven't. These are the teams I work with, so I can't speak for all teams that have tried this
Sure.
architecture, but they they felt sort of freed of like I don't have to worry about breaking anyone anymore. I can just add files, and and then then I can just focus on my story and not
Yeah.
worry about oh God, what am I doing to the rest of the system? Um,
That's got to greatly simplify your check-ins to your source repository as well.
oh right, yeah. There's like the merge conflicts.
Yeah.
Although when we first started this was before like SDK style projects, so we still had those things to worry about. But still, I was only ever adding files mostly, right? I mean, there's always going to be some
Yeah.
shared things. We still have the one database, so
Yeah.
there's going to be something shared there. But we were generally only adding features and functionality of the system, not going back and modifying things. And then even on disk, like it just like your pull request review, it's just like I'm not having to go through like, okay, where does this like does this get called? I can't tell from looking at like, a diff in GitHub if this
Yeah.
is going to be used by anything else or what's using it. I don't have to pull it. Like it's very clear that it's just adding new things, not
Mhm.
changing things.
So for someone listening that maybe is still a little new to vertical slice, hasn't seen the great talks that you've got online and other content that you've got about it,
I have
what is
talks.
this?
I don't grade or not. I don't know.
Well, I think they're a good introduction to the topic anyway for somebody who's interested. Um, but there's this request handler response pattern that you
Hmm.
follow in vertical slice architecture. And I
Hmm.
think what's one of the genius moments maybe that happened when you were coming up with some of this is that the request is aware of the response type. Can you talk a little bit about why that's important? Because I think someone who first sees that might think that sounds like a weird kind of coupling that is unnecessary.
Yeah. The I mean, some of the good things I was encountering before all of this slicing stuff were those really old like adages of like Yagni, you aren't going to need it, so don't like add it until the need presents itself. But there's also this idea of dry or don't repeat yourself. Um, but some of the things we were doing was like assuming that we were repeating yourself when in reality it wasn't repeat like the business didn't assume we were repeating ourselves, that they saw two pages. They didn't assume that like those two things were sharing a same type or class or whatever underneath the covers. They assumed that if I ask you to change this page, it's not going to affect that page because those are two pages. Why would those things be the same? But we were initially were like, oh, this one page shares 80% of that page, so why don't we quote just use the same DTO classes for both of those pages so that we don't have to type so much because gosh darn it, our fingers get so tired of typing things. So it started out this idea that we don't try to share those things, that we let those, like if every screen is unique, that we design our DTOs or our view models to be one-to-one with the views. So it started out with the like kind of output would be one-to-one. And then the next part was saying, well, then if our output is always distinct to the use case, then the input model should be distinct to that output as well, because those are all, I can't have one input that somehow results in two outputs. So keeping those all kind of tied together means that we always knew this input will lead to this output, and there was no ambiguity, no thoughts, no whatever around it. And that really was an evolution where it started out with like, you start out with a service class. Your controller or whatever talks to a service, and that service has 8 methods on it, and each method only is tied to one specific controller action. So we're like, okay, well then make each individual method its own individual class, and that's kind of the prototypical handler class. And then we saw that sometimes we were creating like parameter objects, you would call them, like take all the method parameters and put them into one object, and that becomes a parameter object. So if you add more parameters, you're not having to change the signature of the class. We were noticing that sometimes we were doing that and sometimes we weren't. And to stop people's opinions from leaking in, we just said, forget it. It's always one single parameter object to these methods, and that's it. And then we saw, well, all these service classes look exactly the same. It's a
Mm-hmm.
service with one method, and that method takes one parameter object and outputs one object. Like, well,
Yeah.
there's clearly some higher level concept here.
Yeah.
And a lot of other people at the time were having the same kind of ideas of like, well, this is some request handler that some class that handles a request for information or to do work and results in some response. So just
Mm-hmm.
codify that you have a handler, takes a request, returns a response, and all those things are inherently tied together. So make the design intent explicit
Right.
in our interfaces and whatnot.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It reminds me a little bit of the back end for front end concept, which maybe is no surprise because they're pretty much based on the same architectural um, underlying pattern, which is that when you reuse stuff for multiple purposes, it creates a risk of you change it for purpose A and you break it for purpose B.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, there are definitely cases where you need that, but it's much harder. It's a much
yeah,
harder
sure.
thing that people that going into it don't necessarily understand. It's like, oh, let's quote just expose an API, and the thing we need for our internal system will be the same API because we want to be consumers of our own clients
Right.
or
Yeah.
clients of our own servers. But then you realize like it's so much harder to change because you got some other Yahoo that's calling your API, and
Right.
you want to change it, and you can't because you can deploy both apps at the same time. But someone else is doing something else. They're like, oh,
Yes.
okay, that's not unlike saying like someone needs reports over in accounting. So you're like, fine, here's a connection string. Go at it. And then suddenly you can't change any database schema because they know your
Right.
internals.
What could go wrong with that? Uh, Perhaps the thing you're best known for, I would argue, is AutoMapper. I would say Mediator, though, is a library that you're maybe second most known for, and I think maybe that will change someday, and maybe those will swap. We'll see. But AutoMapper's older, so that of course gives it a leg up. But let's talk about Mediator a little bit because I think with the
I am happy
VSA.
to report that Mediator officially has more stars, GitHub stars, than
Okay.
AutoMapper. Not more downloads, but more stars. So
Okay.
whatever
So
that
that inflection
means.
point might be soon.
Oh God, I don't know. I don't want more downloads. I mean, that's just more issues, like literally GitHub issues.
I feel like I have heard you talk about Mediator in a way before that you get. It sounds like maybe you get as many complaints as you get attaboys for that. But
Yeah, I mean, at some point too, I need to come up with like a uh, best practices or like usage guidelines.
mm,
I didn't do that for AutoMapper, and then like 3 years later, I'm like, what did y'all do? Look what you did to my boy. Something I built for a very specific use case suddenly became
yeah,
like something that enable all sorts of insanity. So yeah, those things, those patterns we had in place after like the third or fourth project, my boss at the time was like, Jimmy, we're not like, I don't this is the fourth project we're copying the same code into.
mm,
You should make a NuGet package out of this. So we stopped doing this. So that's what I did. I went to the 3 or 4 or 5 different client projects that had copied and pasted this code, and
mm-hmm.
then I pull like compared and contrast like what are we doing, how are we using this, and pulled it out, and then made a package out of that. And that's what Mediator became, is pulling it out of the projects that were using it,
Yeah.
and making a package. Well, making a new package and then retrofitting existing clients
So that
because I didn't.
almost sounds like a mea culpa saying that you copied it a few times, but I think that that's maybe good architecture to have forced yourself to know that you wanted to copy and paste it a few times before you decided to turn it into a
Yeah,
package.
I made a mistake. My very first open source project, I made the mistake of being speculative. Like, I'll
Mm,
build this and maybe someone will like it, and then I feel good about myself or something. And then like I never wound up using it, and then people were like asking me to make all these feature changes and stuff, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't even know if this project is a good idea or not. So I just wound up abandoning it. So I kind of made it a point that any future open source projects that weren't strictly just fun experimentation
yeah.
were things that I would, develop as part of a project, and then, okay, prove it works. They're like a real client need, and then, put it to the paces in production, and then pull it out. So something like AutoMapper, that was like, oh, 9 to 12 months or something before I released the first release on Codeplex or whatever. And the same thing with Mediator is like, I wanted to put it through the paces. Actually, truly, I didn't want to make another open source project. It's like I had enough headaches with one that got popular. I was like, I don't want, not that's the like popularity is a bad thing. It's just I wanted to have a little bit of a higher bar. Like I was getting
Right.
burnt out with that. So I was like, well,
I'm sure that's
do
a
we
lot
really
more
really need this?
challenging.
And then like it's 100 lines of code. Like how much is that? So, but I was happy I did because it let us kind of standardize as well as let it flourish. Like there are additional patterns and use cases I didn't really think of that if I still just copying the code, I wouldn't have thought of, or
Yeah.
but decided like make this a sort of standard feature that you can take advantage of, that sort of thing.
Well, Mediator is for those that don't know, is a .NET Mediator library, NuGet package, and let's say someone's thinking about trying the vertical slice architecture. What's the argument? Obviously, they don't have to use Mediator to do that, but what's the argument to be made for using it? Like, what pain point does that solve for somebody if they're trying to do VSA?
Yeah, so I can answer that a little bit different way, which is like, in what cases do I find that it's necessary? to put that pattern in place, specifically this kind of mediator command processor sort of thing. And it's really in the cases where the application framework I'm using is not amenable to this sort of handler-based architecture. So if you think of controllers, API controllers, or MPC controllers, it's a file that with a file of a class, a file that handles many different disparate requests in different use cases. So it's like it's naturally it's a natural violation of the interface segregation principle, I guess, the I in solid. If people still follow that sort of thing, but just you have one single class that has a lot of different responsibilities, and it's only structured that way because there's some like built-in conventions around routing and URLs and stuff. But if you contrast that with things that aren't necessarily bound to that single file structure, then it might look a bit different. So a controller with many actions, none of the actions really have anything to do with each other. So you kind of want to put a separation between you and that more heavyweight, very, framework specific abstraction. And then you want to be one level below that's like, I just really want to deal in these DTOs and dependencies, like my handler has to do stuff and interact with stuff. So we have the dependencies in there. So if you contrast that with things like Razor Pages is a good example. A Razor page on disk represents a single URL route, but it's very HTML centric. So it can do gets and posts, but very HTML oriented. But it is a single file. It's like, everything you need to do with this route, I do in this file. Or Azure functions, or if you use like mass transit and service bus, all of those are frameworks that really revolve around you already handling a specific request, a single distinct request, which isn't duplicated amongst other requests. Like in Azure functions, you get like the one thing that you're handling there. So for those, like there's not a need for an additional level of indirection or abstraction. You already have this thing that just handles this request. But people have done that in APIs. So there are libraries and extensions to minimal APIs to be able to enable this kind of like single route level of organization.
Yeah.
And so if my team was okay with it, I would explore those libraries so that you don't have to pull in mediator at all. Just like, well, a good example is Carter modules, which is the successor to NancyFX. It's very, handler route oriented. Or Steve Smith's, endpoint. I mentioned a library. I don't remember the name. Anyway, Steve Smith has this endpoint centric way of building minimal APIs, which is the way I'd want to do it. I want Razor Pages for APIs, not minimal APIs, because that's you still have to have like this weird extension method thing. Like, give me a class that is a route, and then everything that goes in that is in that one class.
Well, you brought up Steve Smith, so this is the perfect transition to DDD. If you search the internet about vertical slice architecture and you land anywhere on Reddit, it seems like you get long threads of people arguing about whether vertical slice architecture is just Onion or DDD or with some variation on it, and whether it's the same, different, and how it's different from each other. So going straight to the source, how do you see the relationship between those things?
So to me, it already starts out of like that this idea of a handler for request is that you have this encapsulation of the implementation of whatever it needs to do to fulfill the request. And it's at this level down where I send some request DTO in, so I've boiled down all the HTTP or external whatever to this simple, input DTO of here's the request details, and then some black box of the handler or whatever, and then you have the response on the way out that is, okay, here's the result of this. Then that gets passed to something that may serialize to JSON or render as HTML or whatever. But it starts out with this idea that you're encapsulating the work that's needed to do that one single request in one single class, and even just starting with one single method. So it always starts out like that. And this is how I like my teams to start: is just make the simplest thing that could possibly work, procedural as possible. Fowler wrote this up as a transaction script pattern. The idea that just, the very procedural code initially. But then we have to have the discipline to do the next step, which is the red-green refactor part of TDD, the last part, the refactoring, where we take a step back, we look at what's going on in our initial procedural code and determine if we see any code smells and if we want to refactor that to something else. But what typically happens, though, if we have something that represents our data models, whether it's like Mongo documents or entity framework, what do they call those things? Entities. The code smells we typically see in our handler classes sort of naturally lead yourself towards building domain models from DDD, because you'll see the things in there like, well, if all this code is really related to that thing over there, so shouldn't this code go closer to that thing over there because it's all related to that thing over there?
Yeah.
So I've done a few talks on this, of this like domain-driven refactoring, that if I just follow the code smells I see in my handlers, my procedures, it naturally leads itself towards this idea of domain models.
Yeah.
At least the style we see in an object-oriented land. We don't have to do that, though. If we don't prefer that style, we can, just create other classes with functions if we want to. But the idea was starting procedural, start dumb, the simplest thing that can work, and then do that crucial step of refactoring to then go like, where should this code belong based on what I see actually happening in the handler. And that's what I really like that was different than a much more prescriptive style of organizing code. Is no matter how prescriptive I've seen people try to make structures and references and layering, I eventually get to the point where it's like the methods still get big and large and gnarly. And we have to have those refactoring skills to see like how should I massage this? It's complex, like complex switch structures, but the switches are using different dependencies. So what does that lead me towards? Mm-hmm. We have to understand how to recognize code smells and understand what are the possible refactorings for addressing those code smells.
Going back to like maybe a simpler topic here a little bit with VSA, one of the other strokes of genius that I feel like you came up with in that architecture is the way that all the related classes are nested inside of one, usually like an endpoint class. It's a very small thing, but I feel like I've thought about putting the controller, the repository, and the service class that all do the same work in the same folder before. Mm-hmm. I never thought about putting them sort of as nested classes in the same file before, which maybe that's why to me it felt like a stroke of genius to take it that extra step, because it makes things so much cleaner. But I'm curious, maybe a little behind the scenes, like are there ideas about VSA that are on the cutting room floor that you tried different ways and were like, this is what makes the most sense? Or did you kind of come fully cooked to that idea of everything being nested?
No. That as well was something that is a pure kind of team preference. We're looking at different ways to make it very very explicit that this code belongs to this feature and doesn't belong anywhere else. And there's just a few different ways you can do that. And so we're experimenting with different ways to highlight that, but also still allow all of the IDE navigational features to work properly. One of the things we found was like, if I just purely rely on namespaces, sometimes the navigation features of IDEs, if you just go like, this is the, approve order feature folder, and so everything over there is there, and then you just call something handler. And if you look for some class called handler, well, you got 100 of them, so which one's which? So we're like, well, we kind of have to work within the confines of our tools as well. And that was just one way for us to do that is, well, if we use nested types, then it lends itself a bit better to some of those navigational tools. So a lot of this too, I'm like, I understand that I have to work within the constraints of tools and libraries and frameworks. So don't go crazy. They'll just break all those things.
Yeah.
I try to stay within those boundaries, but make the architectural intent obvious, and don't make it something that is like in a wiki page somewhere. Like, so if we realize that architectural intent with the way we structure, then it's much less likely that someone will like not understand the point of what this is like.
Yeah.
Not understand the point of it all.
Make the right thing the easiest thing to do.
Yeah. Pit of success?
So,
yes, pit of success.
Yeah. Yes. So let's say someone wants to learn more about vertical slice architecture. I know you have the occasional training about it. How could they go about, getting versed in this more deeply?
I have a couple YouTube videos that describe the journey of this, and so those are pretty good because they follow my journey, and I like that because I don't, for architectural for any kind of architectural style, I don't like to start at the end. I like to describe the journey. So if at any point you don't agree with or you don't have the problems that we've seen, then you can just jump ship and be like, well, I don't have this problem, whatever. So a couple of good videos out there. Started off in solid architecture and slices, not layers. I've got a few of those out. And then I've also got a couple of videos just strictly on vertical slice architecture. My blog, of course, I've talked about this. It's hard because it's been going back over 10 years now. I've been talking about these sort of topics. There is no book, never will be. I will never do one of those ever again. So if someone wants to read about it, it's really blogs and videos that I've got on the topic there.
And then if they want to learn it from the man himself, check out your website for trainings.
Yeah, well, I just completed a training. This is obviously not dropping immediately, but just finished my first training on vertical slice architecture last week. And so just be on the lookout on my website for upcoming trainings this year, which I'll go into as deep as anyone wants. You kind of have me captive there for 2 days. You can ask me whatever question you want.
Perfect. And that's jimmybogard.com. Is that right?
Yeah, very creative.
Yeah. Yep. Well, it's easy to remember. Okay,
yeah.
So we've been talking about VSA for vertical slice architecture, but what other areas do you think would be useful to talk about on the podcast, or people do you think would be useful to talk to about making software projects more predictably successful?
Yeah. So this is one I always get surprised about when I do talks on like messaging and distributed systems and things like that. You have your normal like synchronous request response for APIs and web apps and things like that. But what happens when you need like background work that needs to happen to the side? And I always get surprised that people don't know about Hangfire, which I have used for years and years, but it's a fantastic way to like sprinkle in asynchrony into a system and not make your own like garbage background service thing that is probably going to fail and isn't implementing all sorts of things correctly. So that's another one. Like I like to give love to different open source projects, and that's one that I've used for years and I've always loved, and think other people should know about it too. That's async background processing, self-hosted inside of an ASP.NET Core application. So it makes it really easy to add it to an existing system and application.
Most medium-sized applications end up needing that at some point, even if they don't plan on it at the beginning. So it's a great way to kind of back into having an option for doing it in your web application. And I think a mutual friend of ours, Kevin Griffin, does a talk about different ways to do back-end or background services in .NET. So that might be a good guest to have on about that topic. Nice. Well, Jimmy, this has been really too short of a time to get into the details about vertical slice, but I do appreciate your time and your insight. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. That's the end of this Blue Blazes podcast. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this one with industry experts focused on how to make software projects more predictably successful, make sure to subscribe. Trailhead can be found online at trailheadtechnology.com. on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks for listening.